All right, thank you. Welcome everyone to our Planetary Workshop today. We're very pleased to have you here. So really excited to have Amal back here today also. So I'm going to share my screen. Give everybody a moment to get all locked in. All right, so Planetary Workshop schedule today. We'll take about 5 minutes to welcome you. And before we start that too, we do have translation in Spanish and Vietnamese. We have Devesh for Spanish and Sabod for Vietnamese. So please, if you need help, let us know. And we are going to be using a little bit of the menti.com today. The link will be in the chat. And we'd love for you to log in and to be able to interact. And if you don't have access to the Menti, please feel free to use the chat at any time. So again, we'll be doing about 5 minutes of welcome, followed by 8 minutes of chanting, which is going to be with Bhavanam Kevalam and guided meditation. And then we're going to have a dynamic presentation, followed by some Q&A, closing, and announcements. Just to start the morning here at PLT, we are a very inclusive community, and we want to make sure everyone does feel welcome. We're from all over the globe and all different walks of life and in all different places in our meditative path. So I'd like to start the morning off with, or whatever time of the day it is for you, start the day off with a quote. It is our duty to accelerate the speed of human progress. Your endless efforts to broaden and smoothen the path of human movement will render our present existence and your future history inestimable. Shri Shri Anandamurti. So as I said, I would love for you to log into the menti.com and let us know where you're at in the world. It is an interactive map. So we've got Brazil, and you can also use the chat. We got somebody from Illinois. That's wonderful. The United States, on the West Coast, Mexico. Great. Got somebody out in the Pacific with me. Want to fill up the map as much as possible. Puerto Rico, Colombia, Namaskar from India. That's wonderful. California. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful. All right. So again, everyone, we just want to keep filling up the map. We got Vietnam. Welcome, Shubra. All right. Okay, so again, we're really excited to have you here today and to be a part of our planetary workshops. So we are going to start now with some Kiirtan, so chanting meditation, followed by some guided meditation, and then we'll start our presentation with Amal Jacobson. So welcome, everyone, and enjoy.
I'm going to sing this mantra, Baba Nam Kevalam. Many of you are familiar with this, but perhaps not all of you. And it means only the feeling of limitless love. So you can just sit straight and close your eyes. And my friend here is going to accompany me. I think you've all probably got your microphones off by default, which is good because I love singing with people, but over the internet doesn't work. So you're welcome to sing. But keep your mics off, please. And just sit straight and close your eyes, and we're just going to have very short chanting and then silent meditation. Bhavanam Kevalam Bhavanam Kevala Bhagavata 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 Keep your eyes closed. Sit straight and breathe through your nose if you can comfortably. And let the mantra Bhavanam Kevalam continue in your mind with the music. And just focus on the idea behind that, this feeling of limitless love. And connect to the source of love within you. We'll meditate on that silently for just a couple of minutes. Let's take a deep breath. Breathe out and relax, and you can open your eyes.
Namaskar, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the meditation, and we can begin now. Go ahead, Amal, unless you would like to do an introduction, Krishna Prema.
No, I'm ready. Namaskar, everybody. I'm not sure who was here last week and who's joining for the first time, but I'm excited as always to be here. So I just want to thank the PLT organizers for creating and facilitating this space. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so today, since last week was a basic introduction into Neohumanism, I sought some feedback, to try to figure out what you guys were interested in me talking about next. And a few people brought up the point of materialism, in a second workshop. And I personally think that this is actually a really important point, because I think one of the most important features of Neohumanism when we talk about it, because usually if we talk about Neohumanism, we say we extend the love that we have towards humans towards animals and plants. And that's accurate in a sense, but it sort of skirts past some really important problems. First of all, I think even to live as a humanist, even to live as somebody who has a love for all peoples, as opposed to a very partial allegiance towards one tribe at the expense of another, I think that's rare. And I think it's difficult to live that way. And so it presumes that humanism is just this sort of base level that we're all at, when I don't think that's the case. And then makes it that much harder, because it might be easier for me to sympathize with a dog, right? There's an old sort of trick in movies where if you ever want the bad guy to seem particularly villainous, particularly evil, you have them kick a dog on screen, because whatever sympathy the viewer has for that character is just out the window, because people have such a strong attachment to dogs. You can't kick a dog. You must be evil, right? But, you would never have it be the case where, somebody's a villain because they're eating a hamburger, right? And so our attachment towards animals basically, in most cases, extends out to the animals that we have close relationships with, like dogs. And if it extends out further than that, they usually only extend out to what ecologists call the charismatic animals. So the animals that maybe we've never even seen in real life, but we sort of feel like we ought to protect because they're so majestic and beautiful, like saving the whales, or koala bears or orangutans, right? But it's not deep in our bones, okay? It's not truly intrinsic to the way our outlook to the world. Because if it was, then there wouldn't even be the major problems that we see today. I'll give you a specific example. orangutans are one of the animals that people tend to feel a strong sense of attachment towards. And if you tell people that orangutans are in danger, I would say most people probably want something to be done about that. But if you look at the issue as to why orangutans are in danger, it has to do with the harvesting of palm oil in places like Papua New Guinea. Okay, and palm oil is in almost any processed food product you can think of. And the whole reason why it's so pervasive in the food that you eat, there's two things. First of all, of course, it's cheap. So there's the economic incentive, but that economic incentive would only make sense because we, when push comes to shove, don't care enough about what are the consequences of something like palm oil to not purchase it. The moment there was a circumstantial pressure put on these companies, they would go with something else, right? But because that sort of attachment that we feel towards the orangutan, because it's kind of aesthetic, it's intellectual, it's like up here and not really in our lived sense in the way in which we look at the world, we're not always using that neo-humanist lens. When push comes to shove, then the way that these situations play out in the world are, of course, absolutely disastrous, for the rich biodiversity of this planet. And what to speak of plants? If you ask somebody to feel a sense of sanctity in a plant, that's a step that's very difficult, I think, for most of us to make. And so it's a nice sounding idea, but the question is, how do you take it to the next step where it's something that you can actually feel for yourself? And so what really distinguishes neo-humanism, in my opinion, is that it is not afraid to make spirituality at the foundation of its philosophy. Neo-humanism is a deeply spiritual philosophy. It's, in fact, in the book in which Anandamurti or Sarkar propounds neo-humanism, the very first chapter is him talking about how neo-humanism is a protective fence for something. And so what is it a protective fence for? It's a protective fence for your spiritual devotion. So it is essentially a tool for your spiritual life. And so now we've really got to rethink what neo-humanism is. And so I think that if we want to understand neo-humanism in a deeper way, we really have to spend some time with asking ourselves, what does it mean that neo-humanism is spiritual? What do we mean by that? And contrast that against, I would say, the dominant narratives that are in the world today. And I would say that, perhaps no worldview is more dominant, not just among intellectuals, especially among intellectuals, but even among common people, than materialism. And so for this talk, I want to be very specific about what I mean about materialism. When I say materialism, I do not mean somebody who's materialistic, like somebody who only likes Christmas because they want as many presents as possible. I don't mean that kind of materialism. That's more kind of consumerism, right? What I mean specifically by materialism is the idea that the entire universe, and when I mean the entire universe, I include your thoughts, your feelings, and your consciousness. The entire universe is nothing but matter that you can empirically measure. And anything in the universe that seems apparently non-material, like your mind, like your consciousness, like your innermost thoughts and feelings, are ultimately explainable by material means alone. Okay? There's nothing else. And so from that perspective, it therefore follows that consciousness is nothing but the chemical sort of emergent phenomenon of your brain. And the moment you die and the brain ceases to function, consciousness is gone forever. Okay, consciousness is not foundational to anything. If anything, as we'll sort of just explore in this talk, from this perspective, consciousness is seen as a sort of interesting byproduct of matter, but ultimately not important by any sense. Okay, in any sense, rather. So let's go on and try to explore how Neohumanism contrasts against this, and why I really feel like it's important to sort of understand this dominant ideology so that we can respond to it in a critical but also rational way, and why that's so important that Neohumanism is fundamentally spiritual. So this was what I was talking about in the beginning, where in the very first chapter of Neohumanism, in Liberation of Intellect, Neohumanism is framed as something that is intended to protect your devotion. And there it is called, devotion rather, is called the most valuable treasure of humanity, which is quite a claim. Okay, I think if you were to ask the average educated person, what's the most valuable treasure of humanity? They're likely to say, my intellect, my rationality. And I want to say from the outset that Anandamurti is not anti-rational or anything like that. If anything, it's the opposite. But he sees rationality as not the be-all and the end-all of existence. It has to be a rational outlook that is there for something, okay? And so in several places, he has an analogy for this, in which he says that your rational discerning intellect is like the plate upon which you eat the food. And the food is the devotion. And so we need to understand exactly why devotion is so important from this perspective. Okay, because in this perspective, rationality is the foundation. From Anandamurti's perspective, your devotion, if it's not grounded on this plate of rationality, is actually probably something closer to delusion, which we certainly see running rampant through spiritual communities, particularly in the last 2 years, right? But if there's no devotion on that plate, this plate is ultimately not serving anything. Okay, and that's a very strong claim, and we need to unpack it and understand why that kind of claim is being made. Okay, and what I would start with is saying that Neohumanism, which I think is actually an extremely difficult idea to enact in your own life, is at its heart a devotional project. And the reason why I would call it a devotional project, much more than I would call it a dry intellectual philosophy, is because devotion makes a philosophy practical and heart-centered. Okay. The reason why, you don't have the same sense of kinship with an animal that's not a dog is because your sentimental heart has learned to accept the dog, maybe even as part of your own human family, right? But it is very difficult for that sense of empathy or compassion to extend out further than your line of sight, okay? And they've done many, many studies about this, anthropological and scientific studies about how humans are capable of incredible acts of sacrifice and compassion when we're talking about people that you know, when we're talking about people that you have that heart-centered connection with. But the moment you're talking about a person who you can't see, it's almost as if that person doesn't exist. Okay, humans tend to be very bad at doing that. Okay, and that, to a certain extent, has a lot to do with your evolution of a human being having come out of the animal of a primate. If you look at chimpanzees, for example, which are our closest cousins, they're extraordinarily cruel and incredibly violent. If you ever want to be disturbed, you should read some of these anthropological studies about chimpanzees. They go to war, okay? They engage in ritualized cannibalism. They perform monstrous acts of cruelty in order to intimidate, the people that they've just beaten, okay? My point being that these primates are evolved with a tribal consciousness. It's hardwired into their DNA, into their brain. And so human beings, to a certain extent, have this tribal limitation. Okay. And so Anandamurti talks about this, funnily enough, in a book about Shiva. Okay. Where he talks about Shiva as a sort of founding figure of the tantric tradition in South Asia 7,000 years ago. And he talks about how in that historical context, people lived on these hilltops where they joined these clans, and these clans were called gotras, right? But they're essentially tribal clans. And, you know, I would live on this hill, you would live on the other hill, and then we just, because we're two different clans, we're fighting each other. We're mutually antagonistic, you know, and so you have thousands of years of human history, which is very little more than just, you know, petty self-interest and bloodshed, right? And then Shiva comes up with this aphorism, you know, which is leave your Gotra and join the Shiva Gotra. Leave your clan and join the Shiva clan. What does that mean? It essentially means learn to abandon your narrow sense of tribalistic identity, your narrowly defined sense of self. I am this, I am that, even so deep as to the attachment that you have to your own species, and join a sort of spiritualized sense of tribal identity that includes the entirety of all creation. And that can only be a spiritual tribal identity because it's only deep within, way, way, way deep within your mind that you get to the absolute spark, the foundational spark of your consciousness, that you can find something that is so intrinsic to the ground of your being that you share it in common with every single entity that you consider an other. Okay, and so that's what he means by the Shiva clan, the spiritual clan, the universal clan. Okay, that turn towards the universal is an introversial turn inwards towards the ground of your own being, which is innately a spiritual concept. It is not a materialistic concept, because from a materialistic point of view, you are nothing but, you know, your body. You know, and so this brain that you've evolved over the course of billions of years, you know, basically has nothing in common with, you know, a tree, which we now know through scientific studies in just the last 10 years can communicate with other trees and interact with other trees. It doesn't have a nervous system. What on earth do you share in common with it? Okay. And so the materialist outlook fundamentally alienates you. It limits you to your own body, to your own species, to your own life, because there's no larger context that it subsumes itself in. There's no deeper sense of meaning in materialism. So I'm going to explore that more, okay? So this relates to what I would call the consequences of materialism, okay? When there's a materialist outlook, okay, I would say these consequences tend to play out at both the individual level and at the collective social level, right? So at the individual level, if you feel like there is nothing but this one life, and ultimately this one life has absolutely no meaning except for the meaning that you create for yourself, right? Then this is a sense, that creates a sense of existential malaise, okay, of unease and alienation, okay? And at the social level, I would say that the consequences are even more disastrous, okay? So I'm gonna give a quote from Anandamurti that is related to this. It's slightly difficult, so let me walk you through this quote, okay? So Anandamurti often talks about this concept called pabula or pabulum. That's a Latin word that essentially means food. Okay, so when he talks about psychic pabula, think about it this way. You know, you're often taught you are what you eat, right? But that is as true of the mind as it is of the body. You know, in yoga, of course, we have this aphorism. Oh my God, how am I forgetting this? What's the aphorism about meditation?
As you think, so you
As
shall
you think,
become.
so you become. Wow. I don't know what happened there. A serious brain fart. As you think, so you become. And the first lines of the Dhammapada, the Dharmapada, one of the only texts that's actually attributed to the Buddha himself. The very first thing that the Buddha says in that book is, you are what you think, having become what you thought. And so that's the mental or the psychic version of you are what you eat. And so you have to be very careful about what you're putting in here. That's the psychic pabula. Okay. And what Anandamurti points out here is that if you don't have a spiritual sense of nourishment that you are feeding the mind, then it won't be satisfied with anything within. It'll look without for gratification and for satiation. Okay. If you can't find an internal sense of nourishment, you seek nourishment out there. But the problem is that the world out there is transient. It changes all the time. And when you're completely attached to the external world for a sense of security, you inevitably are going to feel like you're standing on shaky ground. It's like building your house on a foundation of sand, because everything out there, the nature of that world out there is that it changes. The meaning of the word jagat, which is the Sanskrit word for world, is that which constantly undergoes change. Okay. And so that's why Anandamurti often says it is unwise for you to seek, that sense of infinite limitlessness in a place where nothing is limitless, in which nothing ever stays the same. And in fact, its nature is to constantly be changing. Okay. So here's the quote. The mind, driven by many psychic pabula, so not that inner spiritual psychic pabulum, which would be singular, this is plural, driven by many psychic pabula, is the prisoner of innumerable predicaments. In such a condition, the human mind becomes extraversial. It means it seeks outwards, multi-directional, weak, and static. It is propelled by the principle of selfish pleasure, which leads it down the path of counter-evolution. In other words, it degrades you. Okay, if you're constantly seeking money or fame or status or appearances, in order to maintain your incredibly fragile, sense of self that is constantly under threat because you have it dependent upon a world that's always changing, you degrade. And inevitably, you start thinking about how you can gain things for your own selfish gain at the expense of the social collective, okay? It always adopts an analytical approach to life, never a synthetic one. So what we mean by analysis and synthesis, an analytical approach analysis is when one thing becomes two things. So you take a singularity, you break it apart into pieces to understand it, okay? Synthesis is when you take many things and you bring them together, okay? And so spirituality is meant to be a synthetic approach. Out of many, one, okay? Unity in diversity, okay? And the analytical approach sees differences everywhere it looks. Sees, I am different from them. I am different from him. I'm different from her. I'm different from them, okay? And sees themselves as alienated from others. That's analytical versus synthetic. As people have to satisfy their unrestrained psychic pabula, in other words, their unrestrained desires with limited objects of wealth, they often create interpersonal and intergroup conflicts. The collective psychology arising from many objectified human minds gives rise to social inequality, economic exploitation, political repression, religious bigotry, cultural perversion, and the all-round degradation of the individual and society. Crude psychic pabula cause the degeneration of individual and collective mind and thus bring about the downfall of society. And if you have trouble understanding what that means, I would argue that the moment that we are in history is the clearest indictment of the failures of this worldview that we've adopted. I would say the materialism is the unconsciously adopted worldview of the vast majority of people on the planet right now, certainly the vast majority of intellectuals. And you have a situation that I was talking about in the first class that I taught last week. I brought up the sixth great mass extinction. There's innumerable crises that are happening in the world today, whether they be religious or political, or perhaps especially ecological, that point to the moral disasters of this system that we are psychopathically enacting upon the planet, even though we're flying off the edge of an ecological cliff. And so this comes down to what I would call the story of materialism. One of the most important things that I feel like is good to understand is that worldviews are at the root of a lot of what you see in not only acting out in the world, but even in your own life. You're sort of playing out a story. You're enacting a set of ideas. Okay. The way Nandamurti puts it is life is an ideological flow. Part of what he means by that is that you think you believe one thing, but of course, the truest test or reflection of what you really believe is what you enact in your life. Okay. You are like the avatar of a kind of ideology that you're not always aware of all the time. And those ideas are playing themselves out through your life. Okay. Worldviews create worlds. Okay. And so I think one of the most important aspects of Neohumanism is that we have to have the courage to imagine a new world into being. It's not just about adopting the right policy. It's about getting at the root. And at the root is the way in which you see yourself in relationship to the cosmos, to the world. Okay. Is this a relationship that is imbued with an inscrutable kind of devotional mystery? Or do you see yourself do you see the world as a kind of stage in which human beings do things? Okay. Do you look at the world in a materialist way? I think if we were honest, I would say that most of us, while not maybe being complete avatars of materialism, I would say for my own self, the more honest I am with myself and the more I examine my own actions, the more I feel like I've spent my entire life being brainwashed, by this worldview. Okay. So materialism is actually quite pernicious, especially because it has completely wed itself to the so-called scientific perspective. I say so-called because science is not in and of itself a materialist ideology, but I would say that most scientists are materialist. And so there's so much conflation of those two ideas that it's difficult to take them apart and parse them out on their own. Okay. And so you see, like, for example, it's very typical where I'm from, at least, if you were to ask somebody what they believe, if they're not a religious person, they might not be aware of any alternatives that exist besides that sort of religious perspective. And especially these days, if you say spiritual, not religious, they might think you're a QAnoner, because of how insane the world's become in the last 2 years, but they're not aware of a rational spiritual alternative. I think most people. And so a lot of people will say in that circumstance, what do you believe? They'll say, well, I believe in science, right? But science is not a belief system. Okay. It's a method. It's a method of empiricism in which you can figure out what's true in the objective world, which is very different from a belief system. And so this is what I mean when I say that materialism pretends that it's gotten rid of beliefs, right? It's gotten rid of stories. We don't need a story to explain the world anymore because we have science. But it is completely unaware of the extent to which it is itself a story, just like any other. So I'm going to go into more detail about this, okay? And so I would say that the story of materialism, if you analyze it, if you take seriously the idea that materialism is true, end of story, it's a pretty depressing story, okay? Because just to give you one example, most people, one of the most important things to living a nourishing and fulfilling life is to feel like their life has meaning. Human beings are meaning-centric beings. You need to have a sense of purpose, okay? But if you take materialism seriously, there is no sense of meaning. There's none, because that consciousness that you possess, which is so important to you, is ultimately an epiphenomenon, a sort of interesting byproduct that ultimately has no import in the universe. But the universe is fundamentally blind and purposeless and cruel and apathetic. Okay. And so whatever meaning you have is just a sense of personal meaning that you've adopted for yourself, that you live ironically, even though you know that ultimately the universe has no purpose and has no meaning. This is a very difficult way to live. And I would argue that nobody really lives this way. Even materialists. Materialists do not walk around acting as though their consciousness is not important. Materialists do not walk around acting as though we do not live in a meaningful world. I would argue that most of the moral and intelligent and rational people who are in the world trying to change it for the better, are materialists. And so what I'm trying to point out here is that materialism is a totally unlivable ideology. It creates all sorts of weird cognitive dissonance because it tells a story in which humans are completely alienated from nature. You don't share anything in common with anything. You have no intrinsic connection to the cosmos, and you barely have a connection to each other. And this is rife within postmodernist literature and anything that you would read about the philosophy of a lot of these ideas. I have got a million quotes that I could throw at you. Here's just a couple. The ancient covenant is in pieces. So the covenant, they're referring to that sort of religious sense of meaning that used to exist. Man knows at last that he is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged only by chance. Okay? These quotes are going to be coming from, sometimes Nobel Prize winning physicists. This is the dominant worldview, okay? Because if your consciousness is an accidental creation of matter that is ultimately meaningless, then you are the only conscious, meaningful entity in the entire universe. There's no meaning in a plant. There's no meaning in a mountain. There's no meaning in the planets or the galaxies because all of it is just blind and unfeeling immensity, okay? You're the only being in the entire universe that has a sense of meaning, according to materialism, which makes you incredibly alienated from the universe that actually self-arranged into your form. Here's another one. We are alien to the cosmos. We are a singularity, we being human beings. The universe is strange to us. We are strange in the universe. Okay, you'll find this out of just about any sort of physicist or scientist who really has studied these ideas. And like I said before, I fundamentally argue that the historic crises, not crisis, we find ourselves in, it's a direct consequence of the moral, mythical, and spiritual disasters of materialism. And so I think one really important point to understand that is, as much as materialism can often be the language of scientists, it's not scientific. I would say it's fundamentally like a religious belief, materialism. So I think it's important to distinguish between science and scientism. So science is a method, right, by which you try to uncover objective truth. Scientism is the dogma that the scientific method is the only way to generate knowledge, okay? There's no such thing as intuitional knowledge, certainly, according to that perspective. There's no such thing as any other way of anything being true unless it's uncovered through the scientific method. That's a very known and documented dogma, in philosophy. But I would say that people are constantly doing it all the time. Materialism positions itself as the scientific position, but I don't think that it is. And I actually think that it's really important that we learn to identify and challenge materialism on purpose. Because otherwise, if I'm a neo-humanist and I'm trying to explain neo-humanism and I try to talk about a spiritual perspective, if I'm not aware of where the other person's coming from, I probably sound like a nut. I probably sound like some sort of non-rational lunatic, to the person sitting in front of me, okay? It's important that they understand what I mean, okay? Because what we're trying to create here is a rational spiritual perspective that can integrate itself with a scientific perspective. Okay, science is not the enemy. And so that's my whole point, is that materialism is not scientific. I would say much more than that. I would say it creates all kinds of dogmatic restrictions in science. It says you're not allowed to think past this point. You're not allowed to think that way because that challenges the orthodoxy. We think this way. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of important examples of materialist dogmas that are treated as if they were absolute truths in scientific disciplines. Here's the big one. all matter is unconscious. Okay, so if you believe in materialism, you believe that matter is primary. And so with consciousness, which you can't say doesn't exist because we all have a consciousness, you have to say, well, consciousness is a mysterious creation of matter, but ultimately matter must be unconscious. Otherwise, consciousness would be primary, not matter. Therefore, the materialist belief demands the secondary belief that all matter is unconscious, meaning you live in a totally dead and blind and apathetic and unfeeling cosmos that has absolutely nothing to do with you. That's the story consequences of it, okay? And that comes out of what is fundamentally a religious claim. Okay, there's absolutely no scientific basis for the idea that matter is unconscious. I mean, on the contrary, I would say, consciousness scientists are constantly poking and prodding the brain, trying to figure out how the brain creates consciousness, because there's the assumption that matter comes first. And they're never able to find that. They're never able to figure out how the brain creates consciousness. Okay, I would say that there's other ways of thinking about the body-mind relationship that are different than the idea, which is the most common one, which is like the brain is a computer which creates consciousness, and the moment the computer shuts down, there is no consciousness because the entire cosmos is unconscious. Okay. Another one is the universe evolves accidentally. And I think this one in particular is actually difficult to talk about because I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but if, at least in the United States, if I want to challenge the idea that the universe just is accidental and evolves accidentally, what I think most people would think of is they would assume that I'm a religious creationist, which I definitely am not. So it's important to talk about the difference here. And then finally, the universe is a machine. It's mechanical. The way it's often described in high school science classes is the entire universe is like a pool table, a billiards table, and you have these billiard balls that are just bouncing off each other mechanically and blindly. And they do whatever is mathematically supposed to happen. But ultimately, there's absolutely no subjective part of the universe. It's as mechanical as a clock, okay? And that creates the sense, therefore, that, okay, now, if I'm, somebody who works in the energy sector, and I want to get at this, giant stash of coal that's inside of some Appalachian mountain, and I believe that the universe is fundamentally machine, and it's accidental, and it's unconscious, and really all that I need to be doing in this life is consolidating as much security as I possibly can for me and my own and the people who are important to me. Of course, I'm going to have absolutely no trepidation about blowing up the mountain and taking all the coal inside, because nothing's sacred. Okay, the coal has absolutely no purpose besides its utilitarian use to make me rich. Okay, and you can see how the enactment of this idea creates all sorts of unintended consequences down the road. Okay, so let me start with this idea. I might even go a little bit over today. I might have to rein this in because I've got too much to say on this subject. So my apologies. All matter is unconscious. Okay. Here's one of the most important things I think it is to understand, which is that I think a lot of so-called rational materialists don't always get, because they unconsciously have a scientific point of view instead of a scientific one, which is that science is designed to help you understand how something functions. It doesn't tell you what something is. Okay, so I'll give you an example just with you. If I were to use scientific methods and instruments to understand you, okay, I would scan your body in every single way I could. And by the end of it, I'd have a pretty good idea about how your liver works, but I wouldn't know very much about your intrinsic nature. I would not be able to tell you this is who you really are on the inside. And the reason for that is not because science is not advanced enough, okay? The reason for that is because of what science is designed to do. I remember I was once talking with this professor of mine who is a mathematical cosmologist. He spent his entire career studying the cosmos. And he brought up the point to me that we don't actually know what gravity is. We can describe in very sophisticated ways how gravity functions and make probabilistic models about gravity. But if you really push a scientist to tell them what is gravity, he said, I've spent my entire life studying the effects of gravity. The best that I can say about gravity is the universe behaves this way. And we call this behavior, this mutual attraction, gravity. Okay? So in other words, science is very good at helping you understand objectively what gravity does. But if you want to understand subjectively, why does the universe behave this way? You can't look to the scientific method to answer questions like that. It's not designed to answer questions like that because science gives you quantities. It does not give you qualities. Science gives you facts. It does not give you values. Okay? And so the belief that only the scientific method can generate truth is what is called scientism. And it's running roughshod over the scientific disciplines right now. And I really think that it's important to challenge because if you really think about it, what makes life worth living? What gives you a sense of purpose and wakes you up in the morning? It's what you value. It's not the facts. You know, nobody learns the facts as to why the sun appears to rise in the horizon every morning and then says, well, that really helps me, gives me a sense as to why I should get up in the morning. People don't behave that way. People are motivated by their values. People are motivated from this sense of story, from feeling like they're a part of something larger. Okay. And so all of the most important things that make your life worth living are precisely the things that cannot be measured. They're not the quantities, they're the qualities. And we've completely privileged one at the expense of the other because of the awesome power of technology. In the last 500 years in which the scientific method has become dominant, we have completely transformed the world, and we have basically the powers of gods. We have powers that would be considered miraculous even a century ago. Okay, there's one quote from one physicist, Eric Weinstein: "We are now gods, but for the wisdom." Okay, and so if we want to wed knowledge with wisdom, we need to reclaim the necessity of wisdom, make space for it, and remind everyone that wisdom is not about what you can empirically measure. There needs to be another way to get to wisdom. And so I would say materialists assume that all matter is unconscious. And the reason they assume this is because the fundamental belief system that they act as if it were a fact is that matter is at the base of everything. Everything is reducible to matter. And if everything is reducible to matter, then matter must be unconscious. Because if matter isn't unconscious, then consciousness is primary and matter is secondary and materialism collapses. Okay? But this is just a belief system. Okay? Just because we can see how the brain correlates with different states of consciousness. I mean, one of the very first concepts in science is correlation is not causation. Okay? But all of this goes out the window, largely because there's a materialist bias among most scientists. And it's a whole other discussion as to why I think that's the case. Suffice it to say that I think the biggest reason is the history of how science evolved in extremely antagonistic tension with the Catholic Church. Okay. And I think it's created in the sense of most people's minds in the West, the sense that science is based on reason, and anything that is not science is just a matter of faith. And ultimately a totally non-rational impulse. It's very difficult, I think, for most people to envision spirituality as something that can be rational. Okay, but of course, from Anandamurti's perspective, remember, rationality is the foundation. It's the absolute foundation. It's the plate upon which you eat the food. Okay, and that's a whole nother discussion as to how I think spiritual communities have completely just thrown it out the window in favor of just how they feel. Okay. The alternative to the idea that the universe is just blind and unfeeling is an idea in philosophy which is called panpsychism. Pan means everywhere, psyche means soul. So the soul being in everything. Everything is ensouled. And this is actually an idea that's gaining a lot more currency, even in intellectual circles, because it just innately makes a lot more elegant sense. Because if you think that matter is unconscious, you've got a serious problem on your hands. It's called the hard problem, okay? The hard problem is, if you believe matter is unconscious, then why is it that when matter interacts in a particular way, suddenly there's a sense inside of this material object that they are an individual who's different from all other individuals? Where does this consciousness come from? If matter itself is unconscious, if this mug is unconscious, why is it that the same atoms inside this mug, if they were interacting in a different way, why would they create consciousness? Where does it come from? That's the hard problem. Panpsychism completely resolves that problem, okay? Because it suggests that if the brain generates consciousness, then that may suggest that consciousness is innate or latent within matter in the first place, okay? And so this is actually the most common way in which Anandamurti or Sarkar himself actually critiques materialism. He gives a whole critique of materialism in human society in the discourse Moralism, in which he says that he equally critiques idealism and materialism. Idealism is the idea that God is truth and the entire universe is an illusion. That's idealism. Okay, you see plenty of that in Western philosophy too. And then materialism. He says they're equally irrational. But the irrationality of materialism, he says, is this. Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, let me just move on to the next slide so there's not these distractions. Okay, in the criminal justice system around the whole world, the criminal justice system is based foundationally upon the presumption that you are personally responsible for your actions. Okay, if I go out and I harm somebody, I have to bear the responsibility for that harm because I chose to harm that person. There's accountability, personal accountability, okay? And we all innately feel this, that we are people who make choices and you can make the wrong choice. And if you make the wrong choice, you need to be held accountable. That's the entire basis of the criminal justice system. But if you adopt a materialist perspective, okay, there is no such thing as free will because everything you think is your choice has actually already been neurologically determined, okay? It's an illusion of free will, okay? And so even though it's the foundation of how you look at the world, you know, materialism is this deeply strange idea actually that tells you that everything you think is actually wrong, that actually there, you know, yeah, in the criminal justice system, there's personal accountability, but really from a scientific perspective, there's absolutely no personal accountability whatsoever because there's no free will. This is part of what I mean when I say it's impossible to live this way. Nobody lives this way. Nobody lives as if, I mean, imagine if there, you know, if you had a couple of scientists who were married to each other, you know, and one of them went out and was, you know, and cheated on his or her wife, you know, and the other one said, how could you do that to me? They say, oh, well, I don't have a choice. It's just my neurological determinism. Nobody talks this way. Nobody acts this way. All of us behave as though we make our choices and we're accountable for them. Okay. And so the way Anandamurti critiques materialism is he says that if you are to critique or judge anything, you need something that's above it. You need something that's above the thing and judging or critiquing it. But in materialism, the mind is said to be a completely imaginary, non-real entity. In which case, who is doing the judging? Okay, who is the one who's critiquing anything? And so that problem you see also being resolved by panpsychism. Okay, it's a very strange claim when you think about it, because even from a scientific perspective, the entire cosmos has, through its own powers of self-organization, organized its stardust into you, right? Into me. Okay, this is an incredibly miraculous phenomenon. And it's entirely reasonable to speculate that if I have this consciousness, perhaps I am reflecting the consciousness of the cosmos that took my form. Okay, but then materialism has this incredibly strange idea that all of this happened accidentally, took your form, this form is meaningless, and you have this strange ghost, you know, called consciousness that isn't real, And then after you die, it will be as if you never existed because it was never anything that was meaningful in the first place. Okay, in which case, how can you use something that was created by matter to judge matter as unconscious? Because you yourself are matter. So how are you judging matter to be unconscious? It doesn't logically cohere. Okay. And so it all fundamentally comes down to this question of consciousness. This idea that the brain is a computer, the mind is the software, consciousness is nothing but the creation of the brain. And when the brain dies, consciousness ceases to exist. Okay. The earth and the cosmos have no consciousness or intelligence, and yet we are judging it by using a consciousness, intelligence, and intelligence created by the earth and the cosmos. That's the way that Anandamurti or Sarkar critiques materialism. If you are nothing but matter, then you have no right or no bearing to judge matter as unconscious. And there's many of other, like this idea, okay, that the brain is just hardware is a metaphor. It's a metaphorical way of understanding how the brain may or may not work. But there's other metaphors. You know, what if the brain were more like a television set, okay, or a radio, okay? If I don't like the program happening on the TV and I smash the TV, you know, it might apparently seem like I've stopped the program, okay, but I haven't stopped the program because the TV was just the receiving medium that allowed the wavelength to come through, okay? And so that's another metaphor that you could use, you know, to talk about consciousness or to investigate consciousness. But the reason why that's not taken seriously is because of the fundamental assumption that matter is unconsciousness. And that assumption is a religious belief. It's not scientific. And of course, because consciousness is the creation of the brain, it does not survive death, and psychic phenomena are impossible. I don't have a lot of time, and so I'm trying to speed up. But I would say that if you're interested in psychic phenomena and the ways in which orthodox science refuses to take that seriously, there's many good books that I could recommend. But I would recommend an author instead. His name is Dean Radin. And he is the head of what's called the Noetic Institute, which is an affiliation of scientists around the world who spend much of their career trying to scientifically test what they call psi phenomena. But they face a lot of resistance, which is incredibly interesting because when you actually look at their research, there's huge amounts of evidence. And even when you have skeptical scientists who look at the evidence, they admit that the evidence is there. But what they do say instead is this last thing. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. But it's only extraordinary because their belief system tells them that it's impossible. Okay? And that's my whole point, is that materialism is not scientific. It's just a belief system. And it has consequences that I think run anathema to a neo-humanist perspective. I've never done this before, but unfortunately, I think I've got way too much here for one class. So let me just go through this super fast to try to get to the more important parts about how this relates to neo-humanism. There's a lot more to talk about the universe evolving accidentally. There's a lot more to talk about with the universe being mechanical. I'm sorry about this. I apologize. This usually doesn't happen with me with classes. But this is what I want to talk about. A rational spiritual perspective. Okay. I think that most people view science as rational and spirituality as a leap of faith. But I think that most people don't understand the extent to which science is only as scientific as the scientists who practice it. And scientists are people as imperfect as you or me. They're as shaped by their cognitive biases and their belief systems as you and me. And I would argue that the progress of science is being held back and limited by these dogmatic injunctions of materialism, which are fundamentally not scientific. And I think, especially in the West, there's this huge tendency to see spirituality as non-rational because of the way spirituality evolved in tension with Christianity. And there's a lot more actually that I have to say in this subject, but I don't know what happens. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time. This is important. The reality is that materialism is incoherent with our experience of consciousness. It is an unlivable philosophy. And the reason why that's important when we talk about Neohumanism is Neohumanism, is meant to be the exact opposite. It's meant to be, how do you live in the world sustainably, trying to enact these ideas that are egalitarian, that are about more than just your tribal affiliation. And the only way to do that, I would argue, is to move away from materialist perspective. Because if I stay locked into that materialist perspective, okay, I might not always realize it, but the whole worldview informing me from the inside out is a worldview that's telling me that I'm deeply alienated from the universe that I'm a part of, that I have no meaningful relationship, to the other animals and plants and planets around me. Okay, it's a universe that is deeply tragic, in which I am completely meaning centric based on billions of years of evolution, but I'm just in a meaningless universe. Oh, well, and I have to live with that sort of irony and existential, terror. Okay, that worldview, when it informs you from the inside out, it works against the impulse to expand the boundaries of your love outwards in every direction, which is what we talk about with Neohumanism. That deep sense of connection that is more than just intellectual, because obviously materialists understand that we need to respect animals and plants, right? The problem isn't that, materialism is an immoral philosophy. That's not what I would say. I would say that the problem is that materialism, when it informs you from the place of worldviews, the consequences of it are always going to be this sense that I am separate from others. And that sense of separateness, when it enacts itself in your life, and when it enacts itself in civilization, the consequences are disastrous. They're psychologically disastrous. They're politically disastrous. They're ecologically disastrous. If we want a different world, if we want a world that is more life-affirming and life-enhancing, if we want a more egalitarian future, a more inclusive and democratic future, then it has to start at the foundation, right at the root, right at the worldview. It has to start with the idea that I share something in common with everyone, okay? And that, I would argue, is fundamentally a spiritual idea. It's not a materialist idea. And so I think part of our job as neo-humanists is to propose a rational spiritual alternative, not a religious alternative, but the idea that you share something in common with others, okay? And if you then talk about how you believe in neo-humanism, and the first thing you do is you talk about how you're different from people because you're spiritual or you're a meditator, you put yourself above, you're sort of defeating the purpose. It's about expanding the love of your heart outward and outward and outward in every single direction with absolutely no boundaries. And I would argue that the only way to do that is to find an inextinguishable, what Anandamurti or Sarkar calls a perennial source of inspiration from the heart. And that source has got to be recognized as something that is fundamentally spiritual, not material. Okay. And I think one of the biggest ones is considering consciousness as primary, as considering it intrinsic to matter. Because if consciousness is intrinsic to matter, then it's an elegant way of healing the faith and the reason divide. And there's a lot more that I could say about that I could have said about it, that I planned to say about it. But unfortunately, I'm really sorry. I really somehow went overboard on this one. I'm already over time. But thank you very much. I hope you got something of it. I hope it wasn't too crazy. Like I said, it really, I went too deep on some things and then it didn't get to cover other things that were important to me. But thank you and namaskar.
Thank you, Amal. That was fantastic. No, and please do not apologize. It's a really important subject, so I think we all very much enjoyed it. I do want to open up some questions, and you can type them in the chat. You can raise your hand, and we can open your mic. I also can, again, share the Menti poll. You go to full screen, and you can also type the questions into the Menti. Same code as earlier. So any questions you might have, again, you can use the chat. Here's one, Amal.
I want to address this actually. Deepak Chopra. I have extremely mixed feelings about Deepak Chopra. I do think that he does some good work, and so I don't want to discount him completely. I don't want you to feel like I don't want to send out the message that if somebody's got a Deepak Chopra book at home, they need to throw it out or something like that. It's not as extreme as that. But I would say have a healthy dose of skepticism about Deepak Chopra, because I'm extremely uncomfortable with the extent to which he weds himself and puts his name on products that have suspicious health claims based on his beliefs about consciousness. I would say he's a little bit capitalist happy, and I think I don't know what it does. I don't know if I would go so far as to say it can corrupt him sometimes, but I have a very, very, very uneasy relationship with him. But he also says a lot of things that I think are good and worth listening to. But honestly, it's like that with everybody. You shouldn't indiscriminately listen to anybody. But I would say this about Deepak Chopra in particular, because he's such a powerful and influential figure, and he puts his name on so many things, some of which I agree with, some of which I find deeply troubling. Sadhguru, similar. You know, there's a lot of what Sadhguru says that I find really empowering and good. There's a lot of what Sadhguru says, especially in the last 2 years, that I find incredibly dangerous and informed by libertarian ideas of capitalism. I don't like the way he advocates, freedom to do whatever you want at the expense of the collective. I don't think that runs in line with Sama Samaj Tattva. And so I would say it's mixed. There's a lot of things that I really like about him. And especially when it comes to some of his spiritual ideas in particular, I think he has an extreme or extraordinary talent and charisma at expressing some really important ideas in a beautiful way. And then there's other things that he says, where I can get trouble. I feel pretty troubled, and so I think that's like that with just almost everything, especially in the spiritual world, especially when you're talking about the biggest figures in the spiritual world. I think there's a danger there. And so just take it with a grain of salt. Measure everything against Sama Samaj Tattva. That's what I would say. Does this person's teaching, what are they saying? Does it make me feel good? Does it confirm my biases? Does this make me feel better than somebody? Or is this uncompromisingly advocating the principle of social equality over and above Atma Sukha Tattva, the principle of selfish pleasure? And I would say, especially in the last 2 years, Sadhguru is releasing content that I do not feel goes with Sama Samaj Tattva. I know very little about the Art of Living Foundation, not enough to be able to comment intelligently, let's say. Well, I do think that there are some materialists who do talk this way, in reference to Harry Elgar. Like, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson does quite a good job of expressing this materialism in the way that you're talking about here. But I would say that in many other things that Neil deGrasse Tyson puts out, especially in Cosmos, it's so deeply anthropocentric and frustratingly so, where I feel like he's completely missing the mark and sending people down the wrong direction. And when I ask myself, why is this the case? I think it's because it's as much as I respect Neil deGrasse Tyson, as much as I feel like he's rendering a profound service to society with the way he teaches science, especially to children. I use his content in my classroom sometimes. This idea of materialism is so deep within him that I think it fundamentally limits some of what I would call his spiritual impulses and what I'm sure he doesn't consider his spiritual impulse. He is also incredibly opposed to not just spirituality, but philosophy. He thinks that philosophy is obsolete because science has replaced it. I mean, he might as well be the incarnation of scientism. It's really incredible how some of these people who are geniuses in their field, I mean, sometimes I feel like, not necessarily Neil deGrasse Tyson, but some of them, I feel like they couldn't pass a sophomore philosophy course. But I do think that there is absolutely a mystical or spiritual aspect of materialism with the fact that we're all stardust nourished by sunlight, that fundamentally we're not sure what to make of that. It's almost like this strange outlier, because there's so much else in materialism that says that, you know, it's ultimately not important. It's just cool. How can we make people who have been stuck to materialism, scientism perspective adopt this new perspective? It's pretty hard to get out of this worldview. Well, I'm not sure that you can convert them necessarily, but I think it's really good to ask questions, you know. And so I like asking questions, you know, like, you know, you say that all matter is unconscious. Does that include you? Because ultimately you are ultimately reducible just to the matter in your brain. So you're not important. So how can you say that you're important? Why should I listen to you? You know, or I'll ask them questions about, do you think that people should be held accountable for their actions? How do you reconcile that with neurological determinism? And I think for most people, they haven't thought that far ahead. I mean, the people in the field have, you know, and they have some very sophisticated arguments about it. But the most sophisticated arguments that you can hear about this is essentially that it's very ironic that you care so much about meaning in a universe that doesn't mean anything, you know, and that requires a lot of courage to live a moral life in a universe that fundamentally is apathetic and nothing matters, right? I would say those are the most sophisticated people in the field. But I would say that even that perspective does not take into account that most people don't have that kind of character or courage. I think most people, if they're fed that ideology and they imbibe it from the inside out, they don't go seeking. I think most people, you know, how do I live courageously in the face of this abyss and lead a decent and moral life for everybody? I think most people start thinking, how do I get that new iPhone? You know, how can I make more money? How can I be more famous? And so I don't think that materialists take seriously the consequences of that ideology. No, of course.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
I'll throw out more of a comment than a question, I think, as you're talking about morals in that previous concept is, where do morals come from if you're completely materialistic? It's sort of, if there's no meaning, how can there be a moral that you should even worry about? Mm-hmm. And yet we all know that there's good things and less good things to do, even in our personal lives, let alone expanding out beyond our family and nation and all the various spheres we've talked about last week.
Yeah, I think we need to redefine spirituality so that it has more to do with how do you relate to your highest sense of values and your highest sense of the sacred, rather than do you subscribe to these beliefs that come from this ancient prehistoric book? Because I think there's no such thing as a non-spiritual person. You know, every person is living their spirituality. You know, some people are living their spirituality in a very crude and unconscious way. And other people, no matter whether they're materialist or Christian or Muslim, you know, are living their spirituality in an extraordinarily brave and admirable way. You know, my claim is absolutely not that if you're a materialist, you're not going to be a good person. My claim is that this belief, which I fundamentally see as a dogmatic religious belief, is absolutely destructive at the personal and the collective levels. That's what I would say. Could morals come from functionality, rationality, logic, and reason within the philosophy of materialism? That's what people like Sam Harris try to argue, and I think he's wrong. I think that values have much more to do with story. And I think that people like Sam Harris are unconscious of the extent to which the morality that he espouses, that he thinks comes out of his scientific perspective, is actually the historic creation of the Judeo-Christian culture that cooked those sense of values from its stories and its worldview. That's why Baba talks about this also. He talks about how, for example, the Buddha brought morality to the spirituality of South Asia. Values are different across cultures. And what you consider a kind of universal morality is much more socially conditioned than you might realize. And especially when you're talking about the morality of a scientific person in the United States or in Europe, I think most of them are not aware of the extent to which the morality comes out of Christianity and Judaism. It comes out of story. How do you explain devotion cross-culturally to non-religiously identified people? The way I talk about devotion is I say that, we have to start from the idea that we share something in common. We can't start from the place in which we are all completely alienated from each other. And so there is a spark at the very ground of my being that I share in common with you and with everyone. And the more I get in touch with that and try to form a relationship with that and try to see you as somebody who who reflects the same thing that I also have within myself, that is me being devoted, to that self that I see enacting itself through the entire universe, and that's my spirituality. That has nothing to do with a supernatural creator, or various religious precepts. I've never heard anyone, argue with me that perspective was, fundamentally an unacceptable one. But talking about God is a whole nother, bag of tricks. I would say that's like a whole nother. So you redefine it a bit because devotion is a word. Yes, I it's not so much that I redefine it. It's more that I try to talk about what devotion means by stripping it of its religious context. It's not like I'm distorting the meaning of devotion at all. But I do think that devotion has religious connotations, especially in the West, but I don't think that it has to. I mean, there's this really great section, I wish I could remember where it's from, where Anandamurti talks about how if somebody's drowning in a river, you don't stop and ask them, excuse me, what caste do you belong to? You just jump in and you help them. And the fact that you jump in and you help them is a reflection of your devotion. It's a reflection of the extent to which you are devoted to Parama Purusha. And that's, also why he claims that people who follow the caste system are actually practicing kind of atheism, because that atheism is fundamentally an analytical idea. It says that I'm different from you. And a spiritual idea is the opposite. It's synthetic. It says fundamentally you and I share something in common. And I think I'm not sure on what basis you could argue that we share something in common that is sacred and worth recognizing in each other in any sense of story or worldview if it's not spiritual. I've never seen that happen in materialism. What I do see in materialism, like there's a whole movement of atheists who are vegan, it's aesthetic, it's intellectual. They talk about how we need to transcend the fact that we're different from others so that we can do the right thing. It's almost like you need to, in materialism is so unlivable that they're constantly thinking of ways that they can act as if they're not a materialist. Sam Harris has a whole book about this. When really, I think materialists are denying some of the most fundamental aspects of what it means to be human because they have this dogma that's getting in the way of their natural innate tendency to expand that love in every direction, because I think that's the nature of being a human being.
Wow. Lots to absorb.
Yes.
But I think maybe it's, is it a good place to stop?
I think so. It was just, I pasted one comment that was made on the Mentee by somebody that worldviews create worlds. We have to propose this view, Neohumanism.
I completely agree.
Yeah, I think it was very powerful and statement to end on. So thank you, Amal. We appreciate it. And we'll definitely have to have you come back.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you for creating this space.
Of course. And we appreciate you coming. So, all right.
And I just want to thank everybody for your attention and your time. I don't take it for granted. And I hope you got something of value out of this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. All right. So we are coming close to the end. I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank everyone and Amal. And just to remind you guys that for PLT, we have our online platform. And we hope you guys will join us there. We will post this workshop there, and we'll post some more, conversation about this. And hopefully, if you guys do have questions, I know I can share them with Amal, and we can continue the conversation. And also next weekend for our next planetary workshop, we are going to have Dada Rajananda and Jesus Villa, and they're going to be kind of similar, talking about how our experiences affect the way we see the world and a critical thinking perspective. So we hope that you will join us next Sunday again. And like I said, we will bring Mal back. I think this has been a real fascinating exploration into neo-humanism and so much value. And also we have planetary yoga. And it is, we have live classes in Vietnamese and Spanish and recorded classes in English. And lastly, I think Ashita had put it in the chat. We do have our donor box. So if you can check out the link, it helps us. We've had some great people to make some contributions. So we thank you for that. And it just helps us to keep the lights on, to keep doing programs like this. And to also, hopefully in the future, to be able to offer some support to our wonderful translators and our hosts. So thank you, Subodh. Thank you, Devesh. Thank you, Karun, today. Thank you, Ashita, for being here. It's a group effort, a team effort, and thank you all for coming. And I imagine Karun will share a poll. If you would give us some feedback, that would be wonderful. And we wish you all a wonderful day, evening, morning, whatever time it is for you. And we look forward to seeing you in the community and seeing you here for our live planetary meditation on Saturday and our next workshop on Sunday. Thank you.
Namaskar, everybody. Thank you.
Namaskar, Amal. Thank you.
Pavanam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam. Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam. Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam, Pavanam Kevalam, Pavanam Kevalam.
Sorry about the sound glitch there. Just thank you for filling out the poll. We have nearly 60% of you have answered, given us feedback. We really do appreciate that. And we hope to see you next week. Bye.